Since the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453, Christendom had been sluggish in reacting to the advancing Turkish armies of Sultan Mehmed II. However, such inactivity was to change by the end of the decade. Under the pleas and calls of the Pope, a new crusade against the Grand Turk was in motion, but only time would tell if it could successfully put a halt to Ottoman expansion. From the rugged highlands of Bosnia to the fortified cities of the Aegean and the forested mountain strongholds of Albania, Mehmed waged a bloody campaign, not just of steel and fire, but of politics, faith, and imperial vision. In today's episode, we will look at the wars that preoccupied Sultan Mehmed II in the years after his victory against Vlad III Dracula in Bosnia, Genoa, Albania, and Venice. Every week, we release 3 new exclusive videos for our members and patrons: the Pacific War, the Eastern Front of World War II Prelude, and many other series, including the War of Spanish Succession, Punic Wars, Iberian Reconquista, Russian Revolution and Civil War, North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, and much more. It has been long overdue, but we have finally created a YouTube channel exclusively for our Kings and Generals podcasts. Please go and check out Kings and Generals podcast, home to the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, link in the description and pinned comment. To see those, as well as get access to our exclusive Discord, see our schedule, and get early access to all videos, join the ranks of our patrons and YouTube members via the links in the description and pinned comment. Thanks to our supporters for allowing us to continue doing our dream job. The sudden fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks had caused a brief shock all across Christian Europe. 4 months after the Great Siege, Pope Nicholas V issued a papal bull entitled Etsi Ecclesia Christi. In this declaration, the Bishop of Rome described Sultan Mehmed II as a rabid beast and a herald of the Antichrist, and commanded all Christian princes, whether imperial, kingly, queenly, ducal, or other worldly dignity they might hold, to come to the defense of the Christian religion and of the faith with their goods and persons as genuinely and insistently as is possible. However, such a call was to fall on deaf ears. Other than convening a few imperial diets, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III was more preoccupied with internal struggles in his realm, feuding with his scheming brother Albert VI of Austria, and butting heads with Hungary. Meanwhile, other major Catholic nations, particularly those in Iberia, were too preoccupied with the Reconquista against the Muslim nations in what is now Spain to provide any substantial assistance. At the same time, a war-weary England and France had only recently concluded the 100 Years' War in 1453, and now the former was sucked into the bloody Wars of the Roses. It appeared that Europe was too preoccupied with internal matters to engage effectively against the Ottoman Turks. Even after its great victory over Mehmed at Belgrade, the Kingdom of Hungary found itself preoccupied with domestic strife. To fully understand the dilemmas that Hungary faced during this period, we must first turn back the clock. Back in 1452, Frederick III had been forced by his nobility to end his guardianship over the exiled teenage Ladislaus V of Hungary after a decade of fighting with Buda. The following year, the exiled young king returned to his homeland and was crowned in Buda, while John Hunyadi resigned from his role as regent, instead taking the office of General Captain of the Kingdom. Although his political flair had been very much reduced after his defeat at the Second Battle of Kosovo in 1448, the Hungarian magnate still continued to rule most of the kingdom's many royal castles and revenues. However, the surprising death of Hunyadi in 1456, mere months after his victory at Belgrade, would give Ladislaus and his core supporters in the capital an opportunity to seize power from his family. The king first appointed John Hunyadi's former court rival, Ulrich of Scilly, as the new general captain of Hungary. But yet more inflammatory were his orders to the late magnate's 2 sons, Ladislaus and Matthias, to renounce all their inherited holdings and revenues to the crown. Instead of bending to the royal order, the elder Ladislaus murdered Ulrich and even captured the king himself during a state visit to Belgrade, thus sparking a period of high tension within the kingdom. Although initially pardoned for his actions, Ladislaus was later charged by the king with treason, and was later imprisoned and beheaded in Buda as civil war became imminent in Hungary. However, before a full-scale war could erupt between the forces of the crown and the supporters of Hunyadi, King Ladislaus V suddenly died at the age of 17 from an unknown disease by the end of the year. With the Albertinian line now extinct and civil war averted, the 15-year-old Matthias Hunyadi was elected to the throne by the Hungarian nobility in the early weeks of 1458. with his uncle Michael Szilágyi serving as regent. Despite this peaceful resolution, the mounting unpopularity of the new king's policy of revoking noble privileges and attempts to build a new centralized army had led to a grand rebellion of disenchanted Hungarian nobles. With the dismissal of Regent Szilágyi during the summer of 1459, a new civil war erupted in the kingdom as 25 Hungarian nobles revolted against the crown in favour of electing Frederick III as Hungarian king. What followed was a bloody war that lasted 4 years, which gave the Ottomans the opportunity to skillfully annex Serbia in 1459 and vassalize Wallachia in 1462. With Hungary in turmoil and Vlad III defeated, Mehmed II turned his sights to the Aegean, in particular the Genoese island of Lesbos. Since 1453, the Sultan had waged wars of aggression against the various Genoese colonies in the Aegean and Black Seas to strengthen his hold over both regions. In 1454, the Genoese holdings in the Crimean Peninsula were raided, and its regional capital, Kaffa, was besieged unsuccessfully, in partnership with the Crimean Khan Hadja I Giray. In 1456, the Aegean islands of Imbros, Samothrake, Lemnos, Tenedos and Thassos were captured, alongside the mainland settlement of Aenos. Lastly, in 1460, the Black Sea port town of Amasra surrendered to Mehmed's navy during a 2-day siege. Only the last holding of the Genoese Gattilusio family of Lesbos stood in between the Sultan and his desire to control the mouth of the Dardanelles Strait. Disembarking south during the summer of 1462, at the head of a 20,000-strong army, Mehmed first visited the ancient ruins of Troy. There he lamented the destruction of the famous city and expressed satisfaction at avenging the Asian peoples against the Greeks with his conquest of Constantinople. With his immense love for classical history, the Ottoman monarch formed a new narrative, in which his empire became the spiritual successor to the ancient Trojan kingdom of Priam, Hector and Paris. After touring Troy and after many months of preparation, Mehmed launched his military campaign to take Lesbos in early fall of 1462. Crossing with his fleet of 100 ships, he personally led an Ottoman army to Mytilene, the capital of the island, and put it under siege. For over 2 weeks, Turkish forces bombarded the city's fortifications, and despite some initial resistance, the defenders were outgunned and outnumbered, and so surrendered. With the Gattilusio family first captured and later executed, the island of Lesbos was annexed, thus eliminating the last Christian foothold close to the Ottoman capital. A year after his victorious campaign in Lesbos, Mehmed II now turned his gaze to the Balkans, in particular the Kingdom of Bosnia. Since the 14th century, Bosnia had been nominally under the authority of Hungary as a Banat territory. However, over time, it had gradually grown more autonomous from Buda. The turning point came with Ban Tvrtko I, a resourceful politician and military leader who, after many years of intrigues against the Hungarians and taking advantage of the collapse of the Serbian Empire, crowned himself as King of Bosnia and Serbia in 1377. He was to be the first ruler of an independent Bosnian state, a culturally and religiously diverse state that included Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox Christians, and members of the indigenous Bosnian Church, a sect considered heretical by both Rome and Constantinople. Tvrtko's long reign was to be marked by territorial expansion, diplomatic skill, and military success as he expanded his kingdom's borders to include not only Bosnia, but also parts of Herzegovina, Dalmatia, parts of Serbia, and even some coastal territories along the Adriatic Sea. Regardless, the death of Tvrtko saw Bosnia's fortunes reverse for the worse. Between the 1390s and the 1450s, Turkish raiders periodically plundered the kingdom as the central authority in the realm began to fracture due to noble rivalries, a fragmented religious landscape, and political instability. Ottoman sultans during this period also often extracted tribute from Bosnia as its petty rulers now desperately looked for Western aid. By 1461, King Stefan II Tomašević had ascended to the Bosnian throne, and with promised military support from Hungary and the papacy, chose to sever diplomatic ties with Constantinople by refusing to pay his annual tribute to the Sultan. In response to the Bosnian king's actions, an outraged Mehmed gathered an army of 20 to 30,000 in the spring of 1463 and decided to invade Stefan's domains. The Ottoman army, under the Sultan and Grand Vizier, crossed into Bosnia through the Drina River and advanced rapidly throughout the local countryside. As many Bosnian nobles surrendered en masse, Stefan retreated to his well-fortified stronghold of Jajce as Hungarian and papal support was nowhere to be seen. Mehmed followed suit and besieged the Bosnian king at his fortress alongside his army's now renowned artillery corps. After some brief resistance, the walls of Jajce were breached, and Stefan was captured and later beheaded alongside various members of his household and nobility. The swift Ottoman conquest of Bosnia was completed within only a matter of weeks, much to the shock of Europe. Bosnia's incorporation into the Ottoman Empire was to be steadfast, as a means not to alienate its ruling nobility during the annexation process. In 1465, the former king's first cousin, Matija Srbenčić, was installed as an Ottoman puppet king to the region, followed by Matija Vojsalić in 1472 until he was deposed in 1476. The two men ruled a small area in the Lashva Valley, while Ottoman marcher lord Isabej Išiković ruled the rest of the region. Meanwhile, the southern rump state of Herzegovina, also known as the Duchy of St. Sava, continued to resist Ottoman rule under its duke Stefan Vukčić Kosača. But after his death in 1466, Stefan's youngest son, Vlatko Herzegovich, would take control of the duchy, but not before submitting to Ottoman vassalship. With that, a vast majority of Bosnia was now under direct or nominal Muslim rule. While Christendom was distracted by internal struggles, and Lesbos and Bosnia came under Ottoman control, the Albanian revolt continued to be a flame of resistance against the Sublime Porte under its steadfast and vigilant leader Skanderbeg. In the wake of his great victory at the Battle of Albalena in 1457, Pope Calixtus III had given the Albanian leader the title of Athleta Christi, meaning Champion of Christ, while affirming that he was a stout bastion against the fury of the unbridled Turks. Further showcasing his now famous martial prowess, Skanderbeg embarked on an Italian expedition between 1460 and 1462, successfully defending the throne of his liege lord, Ferdinand I of Naples, during a local civil war. Upon his return, the Albanian lord again swiftly demonstrated he had lost none of his edge against the Ottomans, defeating a three-pronged Turkish invasion into his domains during the summer of 1462. During the triple battles of Mocha, Polog and Levad, up to 20,000 Turks were killed, captured or wounded, thus further building up Skanderbeg's legend as a holy resistance fighter. Exhausted after many years of war, Mehmed agreed on a 10-year truce with Skanderbeg during the spring of 1463. However, this ceasefire was not destined to last until the end of the year, as it had finally dawned on Western leaders that Albania, and not Hungary, could be used to launch further crusades against the Turks. This realization began at the Council of Mantua in 1459, when Pope Pius II called for collective Christian action against an ever-expanding Ottoman Empire. Fearing the growth of Ottoman naval power in the Aegean Sea after the fall of Lesbos, Venice would not only renew its peace treaty with Albania in 1463, but also enter into an alliance with Philip III of Burgundy and Matthias of Hungary against Mehmed with papal mediation. With high hopes, a crusader host was planned to be mustered at the port town of Ancona, where it would sail off to the aid of Albania come the following year. With the prospect of receiving active support for the first time in his struggle against the Turks, Skanderbeg responded to the papal summons for a crusade by declaring a holy war on the Ottomans. In the grand strategic plan envisioned by the Pope, the warriors of Albania and Burgundy would attack the Turks from the west, while the Hungarians would advance from the north and the Venetians from the south. However, such a venture was to be fleeting. By the summer of 1464, Crusader contingents arriving in Ancona had to deal with plague, and the Crusade's main political backer, Pius II, had died, thus hampering any thoughts of holy war against Mehmed. With Burgundy backing out of the Crusade at the last second, and Hungary uninterested in going into full-on war so soon after its struggle against Austria, Venice and Albania were left to deal with the Ottoman menace on their own. Wanting to go on the offensive before the Sultan could retaliate for breaking the truce, Skanderbeg led an army of 12,000 Albanians and 1,000 Venetians, with which he invaded and plundered Ottoman northern Macedonia in the fall of 1464. In yet another ambush, this time near Ohrid, the Albanian lord was able to rout and destroy yet another Ottoman provincial army, inflicting over 10,000 Turkish casualties. The following spring, another Ottoman provincial army, under the command of Balaban Bada, invaded Albania with a force of over 18,000 Akinci raiders. Although defeated at Baikal, the Albanian Devshirme child turned Ottoman Pasha had managed to inflict heavy losses to Skanderbeg, including the capture of over 20 of his military officers, like the pardoned Moisi Arianiti. After many weeks of being paraded back to Constantinople, the Albanian officers were then executed, and their corpses were thrown to the dogs of the capital. In the summer of 1465, two more Ottoman provincial armies invaded Albania in a two-pronged assault, led again by Balaban Badr and Shekup Pasha. In the first battle of the campaign at Michad, Balaban was able to surround and heavily injure Skanderbeg, but not before an Albanian cavalry charge routed his army. The two men would meet again a few months later at Baikal, which saw the repeat of the first battle, a Pyrrhic Albanian victory. A few days later at Kashari, Skanderbeg would again ambush another Ottoman army and capture and kill its commander, Jakub Pasha. In retaliation for the execution of the Albanian officers the previous year, all Turkish captives on the campaign were executed, thus resulting in over 15,000 casualties for the Sublime Porte in only 3 months. As the Ottomans were dealt defeat once more in the forested mountains of Albania, their forces in Greece had to deal with the forces of the Doge. Although Turkish troops were unexpectedly able to capture the fortress town of Argos in 1463, a Venetian counterattack later that year saw forces under Alvise Loredan retake the town and start advancing into Ottoman territory in the Morea. The ruins of the Hexamilian Wall across the Isthmus of Corinth were reoccupied and rebuilt, while the Acrocorinth fortress was put under siege. However, with limited men and resources, this Christian expedition was to meet an abrupt end, as a surprise Turkish sally-out operation from the fortress town would rout the Venetians back to the Hexamilion. With the arrival of Grand Vizier Mahmud Pasha later that year, Ottoman forces would again retake Argos and put their efforts into raiding the remaining Venetian possessions in the Morea. Although his armies were victorious on land, Mehmed II was more focused on his naval capabilities, as he was quoted saying, "Venice is a serpent in the sea, beautiful from afar but dangerous when near." As a result of this concern, he ordered the construction of the twin fortresses of Kilidulbar and Sultania at the mouth of the Dardanelles Strait to safeguard his capital from the superior naval forces of the Doge. The Sultan also ordered the construction of a new naval yard in Constantinople, dubbed the Kadirga Limani, to increase naval strength at sea. Nevertheless, news from Bosnia would call forth Mehmed's attention later that year, as King Matthias invaded the region with his newly established Black Army. Although not fully committed to a full-on war with Constantinople, the Hungarian king took advantage of Turkish preoccupation in the Morea and the Aegean to secure his southern borders in Bosnia. The fortress of Yeiza fell after a 3-month siege in the winter of 1463, and its garrison under Yusuf Bey defected to the king's army. This sudden foreign threat prompted the Sultan to march on Bosnia again the following year with an army of 20,000 troops. By the summer, Mehmed's host had reached Yeiza in full force. But in spite of besieging the fortress for over a month, the vigilant Hungarian defense held out and inflicted heavy Turkish casualties. Hearing the news of the Black Army crossing the Sava River led by their king, the Ottoman Sultan decided not to risk an open battle and retreated to friendly territory, but not without restoring Muslim rule in the region once more. The winter of 1464 to 1465 was to be the lowest point in Mehmed II's reign. The Sultan spent the winter in his imperial palace, forging new war plans for the coming spring. However, to his consternation, his household troops were long exhausted after years of hard military campaigning and long marches in the Balkans and Anatolia. Consequently, they were on the brink of rebellion. The Sultan himself had also been in poor physical condition after his Bosnian campaign, growing so ill that for the first time in his reign, he spent over a year in Constantinople. The illness itself was most likely gout, or inflammation of the joints, a condition that would flare up during the harsh conditions of his military campaigns. As a result of his army's fatigue and his health condition, Mehmed set aside the year 1465 as a rest period, during which he demobilized many of his provincial and household troops. Instead of engaging in war, the Sultan now devoted his time to the development of his capital city, and to discussing philosophy and history with the European intellectuals of his court. However, while Sultan Mehmed II was resting and recharging in Nova Roma, the wars in the Balkans and the Aegean still raged on, and new threats in Anatolia emerged to rear their ugly head. In the next episode in our series on Ottoman history, we will look at Mehmed's siege on Kruya and his wars against Venice, the Karamanids, and the newly emerging power of the Akkoyunlu. We will cover those wars as this series continues, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Unfortunately, even if you are a member or a patron, you still have to press the bell button, otherwise YouTube will not send you notifications. Thank you very much for your kind support. It is because of you that we are able to produce so many videos and do our dream job. Don't forget to participate in the weekly polls to vote for the next exclusive video. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.